Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into, well, a really big question, one that's been around forever. Does history just keep getting better? Or are we kind of stuck in these repeating cycles, sometimes really violent ones?
Yeah, it's that ancient versus modern view, isn't it? The old idea of history repeating itself versus, the Enlightenment's optimism, this belief in constant linear progress.
The melioristic theory, they called it,
Hmm.
that we're always improving through tech and smarts.
Exactly. And for a while, especially all the inventions in the 18th and 19th centuries, it felt undeniable.
Until the 20th century hit. World War I, World War II, that kind of shattered the dream, didn't it?
Completely shattered it. That belief in endless progress just couldn't survive that level of violence. And
Yeah.
right away, people started looking again for patterns, for cycles, trying to make sense of the chaos.
So the specific pattern we're digging into today is this idea of a big system-shaking war every 80 to 100 years. The sources call it the measure war.
Right. And it's crucial to get what that means. A measure war isn't like a typical border dispute.
No, it's systemic. It's the end result of decades of society kind of falling apart, institutions breaking down. The stakes are huge. Revolution, collapse.
And the outcome is transformative. It doesn't just end the fighting, it ends an entire social order. It redraws maps, collapses empires, and sets up a whole new global system.
Like how World War II basically created the Cold War world order, the
Mhm.
U.S. versus the USSR, all the post-war institutions.
Precisely. That's the scale we're talking about.
Okay, so to understand what might drive this 80 to 100-year pulse, we need to look at probably the most famous theory, Strauss-Howe's generational dynamics.
Yeah, this is where the concept of the saeculum comes in. Strauss and Howe use this old word, saeculum, to mean roughly a long human lifespan, about 80 to 100 years.
And that length is key.
Because that's about how long it takes for everyone who personally remembers the horror of the last major crisis, the last measure war, to have passed away. The societal memory fades.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they break this saeculum down into 4 stages, like seasons.
Exactly. 4 turnings, each about 20-25 years long. First is the high, that's spring. It's the era right after a crisis. Think strong institutions, everyone pulling together, conformity. Like post-World War II America, say 1946 into the early 60s.
Got it. Then comes.
Then the awakening, or summer. That post-crisis unity starts feeling restrictive. People focus more on individualism, spirituality, questioning institutions, the consciousness revolution, mid-60s to early 80s, that sort of vibe.
Right. The culture shifts.
Yep.
And after summer,
Comes the unraveling, autumn. This is where things really start to fray. Institutions weaken, politics gets incredibly polarized, there's a lot of cynicism, culture wars heat up. Think from the 80s through the mid-2000s, that growing distrust in everything.
which leads inevitably, I guess, to winter.
The fourth turning, the crisis,
Right.
winter, this is the climax. All that weakness and division makes society vulnerable to some kind of existential threat. Could be war, revolution, economic collapse. The old order gets destroyed.
But out of that destruction, maybe a new order emerges. Civic purpose gets rediscovered because it has to.
That's the idea. Necessity forces people back together. Now, the core engine driving this whole cycle, according to Strauss and Howe, is pretty simple. Generational forgetting.
Okay, explain it.
It's what we touched on. As the generation that lived through the last big crisis, the ones who saw the real cost of war and collapse as they die off, that firsthand, visceral memory disappears from society's leadership and its collective consciousness.
So new leaders come up who haven't seen it, haven't felt it.
Exactly. They might know it from history books, but they don't feel the danger in the same way. This makes them potentially more willing to risk conflict, to push boundaries, because they lack that deep ingrained caution born from traumatic experience.
And the generations themselves play roles in this. The archetypes, prophet, nomad, hero, artist.
Yes, they argue that the timing of your birth, which turning you experience as you come of age, shapes your generation's collective persona and the role it plays in the unfolding saeculum. Boomers as prophets challenging the old ways, Gen X as pragmatic nomads, millennials as the civic-minded heroes needed in a crisis.
But is it that these generations are inherently those things, or is it more that the times demand certain roles? Like a crisis needs heroes, so the young adults at that moment step up.
That's a really key question, and the theory leans more towards the latter. It's less about fixed personalities and more about the social role demanded by the historical season. A fourth turning structurally creates the conditions for a hero generation to emerge, just like the GI generation in World War II.
Okay, let's test this pattern. The U.S. seems to fit surprisingly well, right? Almost too well.
It's pretty striking in American history, yeah. You see these major upheavals, these sort of violent national rebirths, spaced about 80 years apart.
You've got the American Revolution starting around 1776.
Then, about 80-ish years later, the Civil War kicking off in 1861.
And then, roughly 80 years after that, the Great Depression and World War II period, say 1929 to 1945. Each one fundamentally remade the country.
It's a compelling alignment, but,
Yeah.
and this is a big but, when you try to apply that same neat 80 to 100-year template to, say, European history, it gets messy.
How so?
Well, the gaps between major systemic wars in Europe are all over the place. You have huge stretches, like the 168 years leading up to the 30 Years' War, and then really short, intense cycles, like the mere 31 years between the start of World War I and the end of World War II. It doesn't fit that tidy Saeculum rhythm nearly as well.
So, the Strauss-Howe cycle might be a really powerful way to understand American development, maybe these recurring internal crises and refoundings.
Perhaps not a universal law governing global conflict cycles.
Exactly. Which makes you wonder, okay, if it's not just generational psychology driving these things, especially outside the U.S., what other forces are at play? What about material factors?
That's the perfect transition, because once you broaden the lens beyond generational theory, you find other cyclical models focusing on exactly those material and structural forces, like economic supercycles, Kondratiev waves.
K-waves, right. I've heard of those. What are they tracking?
They're long economic cycles, typically 40 to 60 years, and they seem to be linked to major technological revolutions. Think the steam engine, railroads, electricity, mass production. And the one we're supposedly in the later stages of now, the information age, which kicked off around 1971.
And these waves have seasons too. Spring, summer, autumn, winter.
Broadly, yes. A spring of innovation and growth, leading eventually to a winter of stagnation, depression, and overcapacity.
And the connection to war comes in the winter phase.
That's the argument. When profits dry up, growth stalls, and competition for resources and markets gets fierce, that economic stress spills over into geopolitical tension. Nations might become more aggressive, looking to secure resources or gain an edge in the next big technological wave. Economic winter can fuel actual winter in the Strauss-Howe sense.
Okay, so economics is one angle. What about social structure? I know Peter Turchin's work comes up here. Structural demographic theory, that sounds quantitative.
It is. Turchin uses mathematical modeling to look at cycles of instability within societies, driven by demographic pressures. It's less about global war rhythms and more about internal conflicts, civil war, state breakdown.
And what are the main drivers, according to Turchin?
He focuses on two key things converging. First, elite overproduction. This is when a society produces way more credentialed, wealthy, ambitious people than there are actual elite positions, political, economic, social, for them to fill.
So you get a bunch of frustrated, aspiring elites.
Exactly. Intense competition among elites and a growing pool of counter-elites people with the means and motivation to challenge the existing system, maybe even violently.
Makes sense. What's the second driver?
Popular immiseration. This is basically the growing misery and declining well-being of the general population. Wages stagnate or fall relative to the cost of living. The gap between rich and poor widens dramatically. Turchin calls the mechanism driving this the wealth pump.
The wealth pump.
Yeah.
That's wealth being systematically moved from the masses to the elites.
Pretty much. Through various means, tax policies, wage suppression, financialization. When you get both elite overproduction and popular immiseration peaking at the same time, alongside a state losing its capacity or legitimacy, that's when Turchin predicts a society enters a disintegrative phase. High risk of political violence, civil unrest, potential collapse.
And didn't Turchin's models point to the 2020s as a peak instability period for the U.S.?
Famously, yes. His models, based on historical data, flagged this decade as having conditions ripe for turmoil.
Okay, so we have generational psychology, economic waves, internal demographics.
Yeah.
What about just mistakes, misunderstandings?
That brings us to another level of analysis, game theoretic models. These look at how conflict cycles can emerge from rational actors making decisions based on bad information or misperceptions. The classic is the spiral of distrust.
How does that work?
It's all about incomplete information. Imagine two countries, A and B. Neither necessarily wants war, but maybe country A moves troops for what it claims is a defensive exercise. Country B, being uncertain of A's true intentions, sees this as potentially aggressive and ramps up its own defenses, maybe moves its troops too.
And then country A sees B's move.
And thinks, aha, they were hostile. So A escalates further. B responds in kind. Even if both started out preferring peace, this cycle of mutual fear and misinterpretation, the security dilemma, can lock them into an escalating conflict spiral. It's like generational forgetting, but based on rational calculation with bad inputs.
Wow, okay, so it seems like a major crisis, a real measure war, might not stem from just one of these cycles.
That's a key insight. Maybe the truly catastrophic periods happen when these different cycles converge.
The perfect storm scenario.
You could call it that. Imagine you have the generational forgetting making leaders psychologically less risk-averse. You have an economic winter creating material stress, resource scarcity, and intense competition. And you have structural demographic pressures building internally high inequality, lots of angry counter-elites, a fragile state.
When all those align. Yeah, that sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It does. But before we get carried away treating these cycles as iron laws of fate, we absolutely have to talk about the criticisms. These theories face a lot of academic pushback.
Right. The biggest one is probably determinism, isn't it? The idea that it takes away human choice, agency.
Exactly. Critics argue history is far too complex, too influenced by individual decisions, contingency, and just plain luck to be squeezed into neat, repeating patterns. And if the timelines are flexible, oh, the crisis is a bit late this time, but it's still coming, it makes the theories hard to actually disprove, which is a red flag scientifically. They can feel unfalsifiable.
Like reading tea leaves sometimes.
Some critics would say so. Then there are statistical arguments, like the Slutsky-Ewell effect, suggesting that maybe K-waves are just statistical artifacts, our brains seeing patterns in random economic noise.
And for the generational stuff, there's that tricky methodological issue, the APC problem.
Right, the age period cohort problem. It's incredible. Yes, a framework that forces you to think long-term, to pay attention to those slow-moving, deep-seated societal trends, institutional trust decaying over decades, wealth gaps widening, demographic shifts, things you miss if you only focus on the daily headlines.
So using the fourth turning or economic winter, not as a definite prediction, but as a model of what a systemic crisis looks like, helps us spot warning signs today.
Precisely. It gives you categories, things to watch for. And, looking around now, it's hard not to see echoes of these pre-crisis conditions described by the theories.
The intense polarization, the plunging trust in institutions, the wealth gap, the rise of great power competition. It aligns worryingly well with the timeline suggested by Turchin and Strauss-Howe for heightened crisis risk in the mid-2020s or early 2030s.
It does seem to resonate. So the final assessment has to be nuanced. Is there a rigid 80 to 100-year cycle dictating our fate? Almost certainly not. History's more complex, more open-ended than that.
But are there powerful echoes, rhythms, tendencies driven by these deep forces, memory, economics, demographics? It seems like there are.
I think so. Think of the cycle as an echo, not a blueprint. It's a pattern derived from the past, a warning signal, but not an inescapable destiny.
So the real point of studying these patterns isn't just to say, oh, look, history rhymes. It's about gaining strategic foresight, understanding the vulnerabilities of our own time.
Exactly. The cycle isn't fate. The critical question isn't just whether history rhymes, but whether we, the current generation, hearing these echoes from the past, can learn enough to maybe, just maybe, compose a different verse this time around.